We're joined now by Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Seymour Hersh, who is out with a new piece on his Substack called My 50 Years with Dan Ellsberg. Also joining us to talk about his reporting on the Nord Stream pipelines. Seymour Hersh, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, glad to be there, you guys.
Right, and so I wanted to start by asking you what you thought of this new reporting from the New York Times and then also from the German press, which in some ways supports what you had reported about the Nord Stream pipeline, and in other ways contradicts it. But first off, let's start with the sourcing. As a journalist, when you looked at the New York Times report, what jumped out to you about it?
Well, first of all, my secret thought always has been it was Somalia. I think Somalia, and then I learned it was on the Indian Ocean. So I now make it Nepal. Well, what am I supposed to think about it? It doesn't, Ryan and Emily, it doesn't matter what I think. I mean, it's either a story or it's not a story. And in the first place, the thing I'm accused of is not naming sources. And of course, I noticed both the story in the New York Times and the Washington Post this morning. I still get the papers in print. I like to see a paper. Both had no sources in it either. And when I worked for the New York Times for, seven years during Watergate and Vietnam, I was hired to do Vietnam. I was actually working at the New Yorker and left the New Yorker to go work at the New York Times because at that point in '72, it was a straight newspaper. In other words, there were guys in Saigon, Homer Bigard and Dave Halberstam and Neil Sheehan, who were doing great reporting. And the Washington Bureau was, as it always was in those days, very pro-president and, and the government. And I was hired to go make whoopee there by Abe Rosenthal. And at that time, it was a different newspaper. I wrote maybe 1,000 stories in 7 years, including really important stories about Chile and the CIA and NSA. And 99% of them had no sources, but they all, they trusted me. Even when I wrote a story about domestic spying that I didn't tell the editors about on Friday, and I wrote 7,000 words that day and was in the paper Sunday with banner headlines and 7 unnamed sources. And one editor asked me a question. So it's just a silly thing to decide that because I don't name sources or I don't put anybody in a meeting, which is the critical thing not to do, that it doesn't exist. That's just an excuse. And so the New York Times has a lot of very good reporters on it. And ditto for the Washington Post. My argument has always been, since I left the newspaper business and I saw who got promoted and who did not, I'm convinced that if we got rid of 90% of the editors, we'd be much better off.
Do you get the sense that your reporting shook the tree loose, to borrow a phrase that Ryan used earlier, on the rest of these stories that are now coming out, where it seems that people in the intelligence community are either putting forward information that in some sense could fit into your reporting or in other sense could not? But do you get the sense, though, that some of these people are coming forward because your report really did shake the tree loose?
Well, not here. Not here in terms of the major media or even CNN. I think we're talking about post-Trump, and post-Trump really changed the media landscape. You were Fox, you were either Fox or CNN and MSNBC, and you were either the New York Post and other papers like that, that conservative, or you were with the New York Times and Washington Post. And so the papers just fell that way. And so when I come up with a story that's very anti-Biden, look, what's going on now in this White House is terrifying to me. I don't know if anybody's paid attention to I think the Prime Minister of China, the number 2 guy in China, has been saying that they're writing us off. They've had it with our snotty comments and canceling meetings because of a balloon. A Secretary of State canceling a meeting with his counterpart because of a balloon, and publicly doing it, and pointing his finger in a public meeting at a senior Chinese official. I can tell you, I know Americans who have Chinese descent in the government, who have taken diplomats abroad, serious guys. And one thing you do is you never do what Tony Blinken did when he was in China, pointing a finger in public to his counterpart. You just don't do that. And so these guys I don't know what Blinken and Sullivan and Newland, I call them Lincoln, Blinken, and Nod. If you've ever had kids, you know what I'm talking about, the children's story. They're just out of their league here. They may have wonderful degrees and diplomas and experience. They're just out of their league. Do they really want to get into a NATO war? And there's no question, we've been increasing the amount of American troops in Poland secretly and deploying much more force, many more arms up in that area. Obviously, with the idea, I would guess, that the president may authorize or they may push for NATO actually to make a physical presence. It's going to be over in Ukraine. It's just a question of when Putin pulls it, whether you like Putin or don't like Putin. How can you like a guy that started the bloodiest war in Western Europe since World War II? We had the Balkans and Chechnya, but this is something else. So you have to fault him for that. But it isn't without some reason, or at least some provocation. We expanded NATO to the east. Everybody's watching a show and knows what I'm talking about. We also put what we call defensive missiles that can be turned overnight in the missiles that can throw a nuclear bombs into Moscow, 800 miles away with 7 minutes. How far would it take? We've also escalated the rhetoric. And I don't know what the goal is. I don't know if they know what the goal is. I guess historically, presidents who have wars do better in elections. I mean, that's just a fact that the public rallies around a president. I don't know what's going on in that White House, but it's very scary and very dumb. And what they're putting out, and the story they put out yesterday is just another example of idiocy. It's not working. What happened here, well, let me just say this. What happened here with the press blackout didn't happen in the rest of the world. It's all over the world. Joe Biden made a decision to blow up the pipelines because he was afraid that he learned then that there was a stalemate coming at best in the war in Ukraine. He wanted more support from Europe, Western Europe, and Germany. And historically, since the Kennedy years, American presidents, this is all part of the containment business, the post-World War II Russia containing communism business. Historically, presidents have been frightened and worried about the Russian influence because of its huge amounts of natural gas and oil that they were selling in Europe. That always tried to stop it. It's nothing new. So there you are. We're in a terrible place right now because the crap they put out yesterday isn't going to work. Nobody's going to believe. Nobody's going to believe that. What their Zeit said, some guys in a yacht dropped it. We're talking about C4 with enough C4 to blow up a major building in Washington or New York even for each of the pipelines. Just go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, you alluded earlier to some of the criticism that was coming at your story around not naming the key source that it was based on. Are you working on any follow-ups along this, and are you picking up dissent within the administration? Should we look for any additional reporting, or are you hoping that the press more generally picks this up and follows it?
I'm hoping that the major press is going to pick this up and follow it. I've had, from the day I wrote Me Lie, I've had people for months say it can't be true. When I wrote the story, what was this? I mentioned the one about domestic spying, and I said the CIA had been spying on literally hundreds of thousands of American anti-war citizens and reporters and congresspeople. And the Washington Post for 3 months, every other week, my good friend Larry Stern, I adored him, who was one of their senior editors and reporters, was writing the stories. I mean, a buddy of mine saying Hersh is dead wrong, it was the FBI. And then, of course, to his credit, Bill Colby, the head of the CIA, at a hearing told the truth. He said, yeah, there's something to it. But anyway, the bottom line is, no, I'm not hoping for the American press to do anything. The only thing that's going to happen is in Europe, here's what the president did, as far as I can tell. And by the way, I've been writing every Wednesday on my Substack. And I wrote, one of the pieces I wrote was all about Norway. If you remember, I said that Norway was involved. I wrote a piece about how Norway worked with us early in the Vietnam War. We were going and provoking stuff in 1964, before North Vietnam even got into the war. We were SEALs were working on Norwegian boats advanced PT boats, larger PT boats than the one that Kennedy was in World War II. They were going they were driving up on the coast of North Vietnam, dropping SEALs off who were going in, gutsy guys, trying to blow up radar sites and military sites. And two of the guys even got wounded badly and crawled back and made it back and got medals of honor in secrecy. I wrote a piece about that a couple of weeks later, making the point that it's not unusual. We have a history of working with Norway. I actually have a photograph of Bill Colby, who was like a lot of these guys in the CIA. He was in the Office of Special Services, OSS, and he was behind enemy lines in Norway, working with special forces in Norway. I have photographs of him in 45 and 44, in the middle of winter, doing all kinds of crap against the Nazis. I mean, these guys, Helms and Colby, I wrote a lot of bad stories about him. And to their credit, I mean, Helms, before he died, he was the head of the CIA for many years and was involved in the Castro stuff and a lot of stuff for the president that he couldn't tell the Congress about. He called me in and we had a long talk before he died about what really was going on that I couldn't use. But, the CIA doesn't work for the Congress or for the Constitution. It works for the Crown. It works for the president. Why does the president keep a CIA around? You got a guy, Obama, even particularly this guy now, Biden. He's not going to get his way in Congress, but he can take a walk in the Rose Garden with the head of the CIA, and somebody can be hurt 8,000 miles away. That makes you feel pretty good. And so it's all just, we're in a mess. That's all there is to it. And we need a president that has more integrity than this guy does. And not that I'm all for his domestic program, but not to go piss on the head of the Chinese and quite as much as he did on Putin.
Speaking of that, go ahead.
Go ahead. I was just going to say, Putin couldn't have started that war 3 years ago. I was in Moscow 4 or 5 years ago. Nobody liked him. You had drinks with some businessmen, which I did. I was doing something interesting there. And you see somebody in the Politburo, nobody liked the guy. We often don't like our presidents, but Moscow was doing trade with America. Americans were on the street. If they knew you were American, they said, hello, thank you for being our friend. And so by being there, and I don't think he could have sold a war against Ukraine. Ukraine was always seen as the subculture by Russia. In 1932, there was a famine. And Stalin took all of the wheat from Ukraine, and 20 or 22 million Ukrainians starved in 1932. It was. I mean, it's a great moment of history. What brutes they were, and always they viewed the Ukrainians were, but they were also a buffer between them and the rest of Europe. Anyway, what can I tell you? It's just it's. We're in a real crisis, and I don't know why the Post and the Times want to keep on playing the game that everything's going to be okay, maybe in Ukraine, and that whatever the White House tells them in briefings is true.
And to that point.
Well, excuse me. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say to that point about us just being in a mess and a crisis, and maybe to borrow a phrase, a quagmire, I wanted to ask about this wonderful piece you have reflecting on your relationship with Daniel Ellsberg. It's up on your Substack right now. You talk about how some reporting that you did in the New York Times led to the establishment of the Senate's Church Committee back in 1975. And one of the interesting things about that is Republicans, for obviously partisan reasons that stem from what I would argue were partisan FISA abuses in the last 10 years, have sought to recreate, let's say, the magic, to recapture the magic of the original Church Committee. And it looks like that's just not going to work. It looks like the country is not capable of hosting another Church Committee because the divisions are so strong in Congress right now. And I wanted to get your thoughts on that as you've been reflecting not only on your relationship with Ellsberg, but on some of the reporting you were doing at the time. Do you think we're capable of recapturing the magic of the Church Committee or of hosting anything like the Church Committee right now in 2023?
It's such a good question because that's exactly what I've been thinking about a lot because Church Committee has popped up quite a bit recently as a sort of a model. It was the first time the CIA was ever investigated. And in the piece I wrote about Ellsberg, it plays a big role. with my relationship with him in a way too. The one thing that came out of the church committee, Frank Church was a moderate, was a liberal. It wasn't very popular. Guess what? Like a lot of the guys in the Senate, he got up every morning, looked in the mirror, and said, "Why not me?" You know, and his ambition was pretty much overbearing. But he was very bright, and I got to know him obviously very well, and his staff. And he did the investigation was amazing because one of the recommendations was for the House and Senate to have intelligence committees, and they were taken very seriously. They set up staffs, and particularly in the 70s and 80s, we had people like Ben Bradley, basketball player. He lived down the street around the corner, Ben Bradley, for years when he was in the Senate. And the kids used to play basketball outside. He'd walk by in the morning, on summer mornings, and they would beg him, shoot, take one, you know, take a shot. And he would walk, and finally he'd turn around and maybe from 30 feet, just jump up and flip it right through the middle. Never missed. Unbelievable. What a neighbor. And Gary Hart, when they ran those committees, madmen like me running around chasing stories, they would only talk to me on the record, which I thought was admirable. They really respected the boundaries. And they had meetings and they had intelligence and they had, between the Democrats and Republicans, there was a sense of unity. And just think of that now. Think how it's been destroyed. We've seen the last years particularly in the House committee with Adam Schiff on one side and the Republicans on the other side screaming and yelling about everything. There's no comedy anymore. There's no need. The committees are useless. Under the rules that were set up, anytime the special operations are put into effect, there has to be a finding. It has to go to the Congress. There's a secret committee I know about in the House. I don't know how it works in the Senate. There's a secret 4-man group in the House Appropriations Subcommittee. One of them. That meets with the clerk and they monitor and they take records. Can you believe if this White House had something they wanted to do, like blowing up a pipeline, would they brief it to Speaker McCarthy? Are you kidding? And by the way, when I was dealing with Vietnam in the 70s at the New York Times and writing a lot then, the Democrats were supporting getting out of the war along with many Republicans. There were a dozen moderate centrist Republicans. The War Powers Act of 1973 that forbid any more troops to be on the ground or air in the war was written by a moderate Republican and his staff. And now it's such a, can you imagine Chuck Schumer now, Speaker that runs the Senate, calling for an investigation of this, of a Democratic president? Not a chance. And in the House, which has now Republicans in control, they're much more interested in chasing Hunter Biden and than they are investigating anything seriously. I just don't imagine why. This guy, Jordan, I watched him in a hearing on financial matters. He actually does his homework. Why somebody isn't, even on the Republican side, doesn't seem to want to jump on this. So there you are. We're in a quagmire. We're in a mess. And this White House is making it worse.
Well, I encourage everybody to read the latest piece, My 50 Years with Dan Ellsberg, as well as, of course, all the previous reporting. Thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Hey guys, ready or not, 2024 is fully upon us now, and Sagar and I have been brainstorming ways that we can really up our game for this critical election.
Yeah, we rely on our premium subs to expand our coverage, to add staff, to upgrade the studio. We just want to give you the best independent coverage of this election, which is possible. So if you can help us out, become a premium subscriber today, breakingpoints.com, or the link is down here in the description video. It really means the world to us, and if you like what we're all about, this is the best possible way to keep us 100% independent, working only for you.